So this is really a follow-up to a talk that I gave to the centre quite a while ago. Sorry, I'm trying to get my screen back up. Oh, where's it gone? There we go. About a model of youth justice that myself, Kevin Haynes, numerous other people in England and Wales have been trying to develop for the last probably 20 years, particularly starting in Wales with the child first, offender second principle that Haynes and Drakeford first articulated in about 1998. So basically, it's moved on apace really. And what's happening in England and Wales at the moment is a kind of the manifestation of 20, 30 years of critical scholarship and research and collaboration between academics and policymakers and practitioners. Starting off with, probably in the first decade following the Crime and Disorder Act in '98, a challenge to what was considered to be an anti-child, the anti-child negative excesses of what Barry Goldson called the new youth justice, based around managerialism, based around risk assessment and risk-based intervention, responsibilization, and the negative elements of risk-based youth justice, new youth justice, have been discussed in detail elsewhere in a number of publications. And essentially, the biggest problem with the risk management based approach to youth justice was seen as it being anti-child and anti-rights and criminalising, interventionist, responsibilising, stigmatising, all these things that are kind of running themes through this conference, not engaging with the child, etc., etc. Anyway, I've written about that elsewhere. So what developed in Wales was a more child-first, child-friendly, rights-based, entitlement-based, positive approach to youth justice, which myself and Kevin Haynes called Positive Youth Justice and wrote up in an evidence-based book called Positive Youth Justice, 2015. Since that time, certainly since I think the second decade of the 21st century, when John Drew took over Youth Justice Board, the idea of child first or children first, offender second as a principle to guide youth justice practice has gained significant traction in England and Wales, and particularly in England because it was already had traction in Wales, and has developed an increasingly strong evidence base, which is available at the link on the screen on a website called Child First Justice, based on some work that myself and Anne Browning, my colleague, have done. And has become an increasingly kind of popular guide to youth justice practice in England and Wales, to the point that in the past, since the Taylor Review 2016 and onwards, child first as a principle has been adopted as the guiding principle and strategic objective for youth justice in England and Wales. So what I want to talk about is what it is, how it's being implemented and what the challenges are and the kind of potential is for child first youth justice all over the well, I think internationally really. I'm not really going to talk about how it coalesces with children's rights, because that's another presentation. It does incorporate a focus on increasing focus on children's rights. And we're about to, myself and Neil Hayes are about to publish an edited text on Child First, which will include a chapter from Ursula Kilkelly on children's rights and Child First. Louis Ford's written quite a bit about it as well, so increasingly important. Anyway, let's get to it. So in England and Wales, this is how the Child First guiding principle for youth justice has been articulated. Essentially what it is a series of 4 tenets or principles, sub-principles, that are sort of a complementary mix of the principles identified in the positive youth justice work and myself and Kevin Haynes, and the principles for effective child first practice that were identified in the constructive resettlement research of Neil Hazel and Tim Bateman, Pip Goodfellow and others. So it's a progressive, child-friendly guide to working with children who come into contact with the youth justice system, based on these 4 tenets. Seeing children as children. I'm not going to read them all out as we go, but I'll give you time to have a look at what they are. So welfare-based, rights-based, needs-based, addressing structural barriers, to kind of link in with Diana's ecological focus as well. Putting the emphasis on adult practitioners as opposed to responsibilising children. And what Child First actually is the same way as what positive youth justice is. It's a direct challenge. These principles are a direct challenge to the negative elements of risk management. So we're seeing children as children rather than adulterizing children. Now, we're developing pro-social identity for positive child outcomes. That's the theory of change in Child First, promoting strengths and capacities rather than pro-social identity, stigmatizing and prioritizing the prevention of negative outcomes as our kind of sole indicator of effectiveness. Doing constructive future focused work rather than retrospective risk-based controlling, surveilling, managing kind of work. Collaborating with children, so prioritizing participation, engagement, social inclusion, rather than doing youth justice to children through prescriptive and managerialist controlling kind of methodologies, you know. Promoting diversion as well. I mean, as I say, these principles that have been kind of pulled out and articulated by the Youth Justice Board and others have been developed in collaboration with academic researchers, in collaboration with experienced policymakers, with practitioners, in research with children as well. They are all evidence-based. They've got a very long history of being evidence-based, far longer and more compelling and persuasive evidence base than could be attributed to risk management. And it's been set out, as I say, brought together, coalesced in this report from myself and Anne Browning, which you may want to read. It's full of links, lots of rights-based stuff in there as well. So it's definitely evidence-based, and also it's important to say this isn't, none of these kind of themes and principles are particularly new. You know, they have got a long history of effectiveness, demonstrable evidence-based history. What's new is the way that they've been brought together to form a kind of coherent principle, strategy, model, whatever we want to call it. You know, to now give practice, certainly in England and Wales, the space and the permission to move away from risk management, the mechanisms and the processes to move away from these limiting, restricting, anti-child ways of working, ways of trying to pursue effectiveness, efficiency and economy, which is what the Crime and Disorder Act was all about. So they have a lot to sort of promote them, and the Youth Justice Board has been strongly supportive of Child First as a guiding principle. It now is the guiding principle in the Youth Justice Board's strategic plan, in its business plan, in it's starting to pervade all kind of practitioner guidance and much of the policy and strategy that animates government policy that comes from the Youth Justice Board and others. It's becoming increasingly embedded as the strategic objective for youth justice in England and Wales. So what we did, myself and Anne got hold of some money, don't ask how, to explore what Child First looks like in practice, because yes, it's got a huge evidence base. Yes, it's embedded in policy. Yes, it's in the strategic plan for the Youth Justice Board. Yes, it's a guiding principle for the National Police Chiefs Council child-centred policing strategy and Sentencing Guideline Council for the sentencing of serious and violent youth offenders. Yes, it's gaining increasing traction in policy and strategy, but that'll only ever be rhetorical until it becomes firmly embedded in practice. And yes, there are, we used to say, isolated examples of child first and child first tenets in the practice of youth offending teams and other agencies across England and Wales, and used to say Swansea was the kind of the gold standard for positive youth justice, and then Surrey Support Service and other areas, I mean Oldham and places like that. But now it's everywhere. These tenets, as I say, are not new. They're not even new to the practice of youth offending teams, should I say. But now they are official. Now they are required almost. And so youth offending teams, my kind of gauge of this, of the context, is that youth offending teams all over England and Wales are now being able to almost come out of the closet somehow and say, we are doing this. We've been doing this for a long time. We have been diverting as our priority. We have been pursuing rights-based restorative justice. We have been seeing children as children first and not using the phrase young offender. We have been promoting pro-social identities through relationship-based practice. We have been encouraging engagement and participation rather than, or as well as, under the radar, when we've been prescribed risk management-based objectives and risk management-based assessment intervention mechanisms and things like this. Now, the Youth Justice Board has moved away from the scaled approach, risk management, risk-based intervention, starting to move away from that anyway. Child First practice has come to the forefront, and increasingly there's a practice evidence base emerging. So the Youth Justice Board's got an excellent resource hub online where examples of effective practice are emerging. Youth Justice Board is funding a series of Child First Pathfinder projects. And so the research that's emerging and the research as effective evidence, the research that's been funded is increasingly child first now, rather than us having to do it in a very clandestine way, which used to happen in Swansea in the early 2000s under Eddie Isles and Kevin and brave kind of maverick people who would push back against a very risk-obsessed set of central governance organisations. But anyway, gone off on a tangent there, a little rant. But anyway, lots of evidence emerging everywhere in policy, in research, in practice. But the challenge is now for the youth board and the sector youth offending teams, the third sector, the Her Majesty's Inspectors of Probation who inspect youth offending teams, the police, the courts. The challenge is, how can Child First be most effectively operationalised, animated, mobilised in practice? Because the evidence base in practice, the guidance in practice, the support mechanisms in practice are as yet underdeveloped. We've come a long way in terms of embedding this strategy in, strategy as a strategic objective, but now the sector needs to work together to make this the best reality it possibly can be for children in the system. So what we decided to do is to ask practitioners a series of questions, key stakeholders from a variety of organisations and stages of the system. Really questions, or consult with and engage key stakeholders around three main elements of animating Child First in practice. How do you understand the principle? What does it mean to you? Because it can mean different things to different groups, to different individuals within the same organisation. What are the challenges to its implementation? So how does it operate in practice? What enables it? What are the barriers? What are the opportunities? What are the challenges? What are the obstacles? And what kind of support would you need to embed it across your practice? And we talked to policymakers, strategic leads, so the YJB, managers, pracs, in the community, the Youth Custody Service, HMIP, the Inspectorate. We talked to researchers. We didn't, because it was such a time-limited project, we didn't get to talk to police or courts. That's for another day, but that's extremely crucial, because child first principles, child first youth justice, rights-based youth justice, will fail at the first hurdle if the police are not fully on board, then fall at the next hurdle if the courts are not fully on board. That's before the child even gets to youth offending teams or third sector organisations. So we convened a series of workshops. We also did some interviews to ask practitioners or key stakeholders in the sector in England and Wales, what do you understand child first to mean in your context, in your professional context? What issues relating to its implementation, retrospectively, currently, in the future, and what support do you need to make it a reality? And we identified 3 overarching features of the responses of stakeholders. There's a huge report about this on the Child First Justice website, by the way, so I'm going to obviously condense it, but if you'd like to read it, please do. So we identified 3 main features, which we then thematically condensed into a series of smaller themes and sub-themes to define them. Childcentrism, cognizance, and professional relationships. These were the 3 main issues identified by stakeholders across different organisations and within different organisations regarding understanding child first, implementing child first, and supporting child first. And I'll talk you through exactly what we found. So in terms of child-centrism, which really was synonymous in our participants with child first as a guiding principle, where these themes of child-centrism were present, practitioners reported that their practice was child first, it was effective, it was working. And where they were less developed, they tended to be barriers or remaining challenges that need to be addressed through support, guidance, consultation, further work, further developing, understanding more evidence, etc. And that's how it worked across the whole the project, really. So practitioners and stakeholders across all groups emphasised the need for engagement. And engagement, I think, certainly in positive youth justice, engagement goes further than participation. The children's participation is really important, but it's about belief and commitment in and feelings of legitimacy around what's happening with the child. And it's about doing youth justice with rather than doing youth justice to. It's about communication, it's about value and voice. I mean, we can link children's rights to all of these. You know, whether we're talking about child first, and Ursula's chapter in our book articulates this further. We're kind of arguing from the same standpoint here, that we should be engaging with children, with valuing their voice, building trust in relationships. Relationship-based practice, absolutely huge as a context within which change happens in the youth justice system. And myself and Charlie Sutton are conducting a piece of research at the moment which is going to bring this out very, very strongly. That positive relationships are perhaps the most enabling context for good youth justice work, child first youth justice work, rights-based youth justice work. So this is what practitioners were saying: engagement, really, really important. Realising rights, and entitlements. The difference between rights and entitlements in a child first context is that rights are minimum standards under the UN Convention, and entitlements are a kind of a Welsh construction around maximum outcomes. But essentially, this is what practitioners were saying, that we should be realising children's rights based on the UN Convention, rights to have a voice, rights to not have their liberty deprived, rights to, I'm preaching to the converted to, you know, what all these rights are, welfare needs and all these kinds of things. Universal access, where these were happening, where these were being enabled by local practice cultures, by youth justice centralised mechanisms, by relationships between agencies. This was considered good, enabling child first practice, and where these weren't happening, these were barriers. Prioritising needs rather than risk. So there was a strong anti-risk sentiment across the stakeholder group, not led by me, but I was very pleased to hear it. In fact, I didn't run the focus groups and did. Because child first is anti-risk management, creating risk-based identities for children. It's not averse to addressing the risk presented to a child who is offended, and through kind of safeguarding processes, but creating risk-led identities through its mechanisms, it's certainly against. And so prioritising need came through really, really strongly, as well as rights. Positive intervention focus, avoiding stigmatisation. Again, that was a railing against risk management processes and risk assessments and risk-based interventions. Minimising intervention serves a diversionary support there. Positive approaches, developmental sensitivity, all these kinds of things. We did kind of foreground what child first was and what the principles were, but these things emerged organically in conversation, in consultation. They weren't led, but they were very supportive of the child first guiding principle, if you like. So cognizance came out as our second of the three main features: knowledge, understanding and information related to child first. So where organisations and practitioners felt that they understood what child first actually was, it had been disseminated to them, and they were aware of the principle and its tenets, they felt that they could pursue more child first facing child friendly practice. It's pretty obvious finding, I think, there. That there was a need for them to be supported and have more guidance around what child first actually is and how it should operate in practice. That was a really important finding, as was this finding about incongruence. There was a big issue identified in terms of the incongruence between what we call policies and practices, or guidance and practices. So there is a level of incongruence still in the Youth Justice Board's rationale for its assessment and intervention framework, which is called Asset Plus, which still has a small legacy of risk involved, and there are processual issues as well around that assessment practice, being quite a kind of a laborious process, and practitioners having to default to risk assessment, their risk assessment training. Kathy Hampson's written about that. There is an incompatibility between the inspectorate's desire to inspect youth offending teams based on managing risk, and the Youth Justice Board's desire for youth offending teams to pursue an anti-risk child first strategy approaches. So these kind of, there is an internal incongruence in HMIP literature and Youth Justice Board literature and guidance. On the one hand, espousing child first principles, on the other, espousing risk-based principles, which are fundamentally incompatible, and practitioners know that and sense that, and have an issue with that, rightly so. And then finally, the professional relationships came up as a really, really important theme. that where there are philosophical and cultural differences, they became barriers, because not all agencies in the youth justice sector are supported, managed, monitored by the Youth Justice Board. So HMIP being a good example, the Youth Custody Service, in the sector. Agencies, multi-agency and interagency work, in one of the biggest potential barriers is philosophical and cultural differences, different organisational cultures, agendas, priorities. You know this. Interagency partnership working, the need to educate others and make others aware about what Child First actually is, why it's needed, what the rationale is, what the evidence base is. Organisational identity became really, really. Oh, I've gone back. Sorry. Exciting. There we go. Sorry about that. So I mean, to distill what the professional relationships issue were, there are multiple agencies working with children in the youth justice system of England and Wales, as there are in Scotland and Northern Ireland. And not all of them necessarily know the same amount about Child First or are signed up to the Child First guiding principle. Some pursue agendas and have identities that may be actively obstructive to Child First. If they, for example, have got a legacy of support for risk management. And so organisational identity, interrelationships, compromise, educating each other, working to a common kind of child-friendly, child-facing agenda was really, really important to practice in order to promote, particularly to youth offending teams, to promote Child First ways of working. So to summarise, we put together a series of recommendations to the Youth Justice Board. The Youth Justice Board, for anyone that don't know, they monitor and manage the youth justice system, not custody, but the youth justice system, particularly the offending teams in England and Wales, and set the strategy that animates government policy, youth justice policy in practice, and work very closely with youth offending teams in the third sector and the youth custody service to promote effective child-friendly youth justice practice. So we went to the Youth Justice Board firstly with a series of recommendations based around these features that we'd identified. We said that the sector should prioritise Child First principles and promote collaboration between stakeholders, and the Youth Justice Board are firmly supportive of that. Wrote back to us with a detailed response to each of the recommendations. Firmly supported that Child First will continue to be the guiding principle for youth justice in Wales. That stakeholders should collaborate more broadly. That the Youth Justice Board should talk more closely to the inspectorate, for example, which they are doing in a series of workshops to develop a shared understanding of where Child First fits and how youth offending teams should be inspected around Child First principles. The Youth Justice Board are revising their case management guidance to make it, in part at least, to make it more child first. Their case management guidance to practitioners. Unitas, who run training for youth justice practitioners, are embedding a Child First module within their training package. Youth Justice Board are conducting a systems mapping exercise with a group of academics and other stakeholders around Child First. We suggested the Youth Justice Board revisit their out-of-court guidance because out-of-court sentencing is increasingly important in England and Wales, and there's a need to embed more Child First considerations within it. The Youth Justice Board is starting to do, although they've only got can only partially support a recommendation like that because they don't own some of the key issues relating to developing out-of-court guidance, national standards, the Youth Gravity Matrix, which is a police. But very supportive there. Professional relationships, we suggested that interagency collaboration is absolutely central to developing Child First. Central leadership from governance agencies like the Youth Justice Board, which they of course signed up to. I think they've done a really good job and in a very open-minded way with previously very critical academics, with researchers, with practitioners, with third sector organisations, with campaign groups, to drive this agenda forward. They're starting to work with HMIP through a series of workshops to achieve a kind of, as I said, a shared understanding of what Child First is in practice, how it should work, how it should be inspected. The Youth Justice Board will continue to support local leadership and governance around the development of Child First youth justice. They've got governance guidance, they've got open officer support to youth offending teams and to youth offending team management boards, which are locally led. So the Youth Justice Board can't prescribe that they are child first, but they can certainly try to influence and help and support. Each local area produces a youth offending team produces a youth justice plan in England and Wales, and obviously the Youth Justice Board can offer guidance, support and advice there. That's increasingly child first and evidence led. They are producing draft practice innovation strategy. They have stakeholder engagement networks. So I lead the Child First Academic Advisory, whatever we're called, network. But we have a series of academic advisory networks around key issues relating to youth justice, not just child first, but disproportionality and things like that, serious violence. They have third sector engagement groups, they have practice engagement groups, they have external engagement groups with Ministry of Justice and with HMIP and with kind of police. So they're very, very working in a very, very collaborative and evidence-led way to develop professional relationships to evolve child first in practice, and seeing children as children. This probably the central theme or tenet of Child First as a guiding principle. There's a commonality of language emerging across strategy and practice documents in England and Wales, and inspection documents in England and Wales. For example, we use the word child as standard now rather than young person. Risk has been largely, the idea of risk and risk assessment has largely been eradicated in the language that we use and replaced by needs and strengths and positives and all those good things that are supportive to and enabling of child first practice. And then finally, in terms of cognizance, sort of knowledge and understanding and information, I recommended that the sector should be supported to better understand what child first practice should look like through guidance and further collaboration work, ongoing collaboration, not prescription from the centre, which the Youth Justice Board is not about that anymore. That there are certain conceptual and practice and training gaps that need to be filled around what child first trauma-informed practice looks like, what child first looks like and in terms of its relationship to children's rights, what child first restorative justice might look like, for example. The Youth Justice Board is revising its Asset Plus assessment and intervention framework with a much more child first lens, but can only partially accept that recommendation because it's got a limited resource. I mean, that's fair enough, and the whole sector is responsible for developing child first. It's not all about the Youth Justice Board. We strongly suggested that the concrete outcomes are developed for child first. What do positive outcomes actually look like? How can they be measured? For example, if the inspectorate needs to inspect and measure and evaluate child first practice, what are the outcomes that it's inspecting and measuring? So there's a kind of there's an exercise going on at the moment amongst the advisory groups to develop some softer positive outcomes for child first. But the Youth Justice Board doesn't own the key performance indicators for youth justice practice. The government does. So they're working with the Ministry of Justice to look at this area too, ongoing, and pursuing common ground, a dialogue with the inspectorate around what prioritising child first in inspections and hopefully trying to move away from the, I'm going to say, obsession with risk management that's unhealthy and anti-child. And what Keith Fraser at the Youth Justice Board's chair calls Coalitions for Positive Change. So there's a lot of collaboration work going on across the sector. Obviously, we need to bring the police and the courts into it. There's work with, obviously, children are part of these advisory networks as well. And there's a lot of really important and innovative collaborative work with children going on, which is to be expected, as it's a central principle of Child First. So really what we've got is, and there's the reports on the Child First Justice website. So what we've got is an evidence-based principle objective that has now is rapidly becoming a practice reality, and the sector is collaborating and to identify the challenges to making this a more effective practice reality and to address them in a variety of ways to the benefit of children, really. And that's where we are at the moment. I hope that's how I see it anyway. So it's a really vibrant and a really progressive context in England and Wales that I think is synergistic with the children's rights facing work that's going on in Scotland, and I know Northern Ireland are very keen on moving to a much more child first based approach as well, because I've worked with them. There you go. I've run aground now, Fiona.